Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be beginning an interim series on Ludwig von Mises's The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality. As I've done in previous series, we'll be doing an analysis and review of each read at the end of the read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video's description to the analysis and review part of the video, so you can jump straight to that if that's how you'd like to go about things. I did mention that this is an interim read, and that's because I'm working on some projects that are just taking too long that you guys are really going to like, so stay tuned. So I needed something short so I can get through quickly enough to have just something in the meantime for you guys. And ulterior motive, to also get your input now that we've finished Economic Facts and Fallacies by Thomas Sowell and the parallel read in Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. I'm looking to get your feedback, to get your input on what you want me to read next. We did those two reads as parallel reads based on your input, so let me know in the comments section what it is you want me to read next. The reason I picked this read in particular is it's short, and I just finished the book, and I absolutely loved it. So review will be out shortly. Pay attention. Probably as soon as we get through the 4 chapters of this book. And quite frankly, though the book was written in 1956 and it's 2022, I cannot think of a more apt time to read a more apt book, which is really more of an incredibly long essay. So with all that out of the way, let's begin tonight's read, which is going to be the introduction and chapter 1. The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality. Introduction. The substitution of laissez-faire capitalism for the pre-capitalistic methods of economic management has multiplied population figures and raised in an unprecedented way the average standard of living. A nation is more prosperous today the less it has tried to put obstacles in the way of the spirit of free enterprise and private initiative. The people of the United States are more prosperous than the inhabitants of all other countries because their government embarked later than the governments in other parts of the world upon the policy of obstructing business. Nonetheless, many people, and especially intellectuals, passionately loathe capitalism. As they see it, this ghastly mode of society's economic organization has brought about nothing but mischief and misery. Men were once happy and prosperous in the good old days preceding the Industrial Revolution. Now under capitalism, the immense majority are starving paupers, ruthlessly exploited by rugged individualists. For these scoundrels, nothing counts but their moneyed interests. They do not produce good and really useful things, but only what will yield the highest profits. They poison bodies with alcoholic beverages and tobacco, and souls and minds with tabloids, lascivious books, and silly moving pictures. The quote-unquote ideological superstructure of capitalism is a literature of decay and degradation, the burlesque show and the art of striptease, the Hollywood pictures, and the detective stories. The bias and bigotry of public opinion manifests itself most clearly in the fact that it attaches the epithet capitalistic exclusively to things abominable, never to those of which everybody approves. How can any good come from capitalism? What is valuable has been produced in spite of capitalism, but the bad things are excrescences of capitalism. It is the task of this essay to analyze this anti-capitalistic bias and to disclose its roots and its consequences. Chapter 1. The Social Characteristics of Capitalism and the Psychological Causes of its Vilification. Part 1. The Sovereign Consumer. The characteristic feature of modern capitalism is mass production of goods destined for consumption by the masses. The result is a tendency towards a continuous improvement in the average standard of living, a progressing enrichment of the many. Capitalism deproletarianizes the quote-unquote common man and elevates him to the rank of a quote-unquote bourgeois. On the market of a capitalistic society, the common man is the sovereign consumer whose buying or abstention from buying ultimately determines what should be produced and in what quantity and quality. Those shops and plants which cater exclusively or predominantly to the wealthier citizens' demand for refined luxuries play merely a subordinate role in the economic setting of the market economy. They never attain the size of big business. Big business always serves, directly or indirectly, the masses. It is this ascension of the multitude in which the radical social change brought about by the Industrial Revolution consists. Those underlings, who in all the preceding ages of history had formed the herds of slaves and serfs, of paupers and beggars, became the buying public, for whose favor the businessmen canvass. They are the customers who are, quote-unquote, always right, the patrons who have the power to make poor suppliers rich and rich suppliers poor. There are in the fabric of a market economy, not sabotaged by the nostrums of governments and politicians, no grandees and squires keeping the populace in submission, collecting tributes and imposts, and gaudily feasting while the villains must put up with the crumbs. The profit system makes those men prosper who have succeeded in filling the wants of people in the best possible and cheapest way. Wealth can be acquired only by serving the consumers. The capitalists lose their funds as soon as they fail to invest them in those lines in which they satisfy best the demands of the public. In a daily repeated plebiscite, in which every penny gives a right to vote, the consumers determine who should own and run the plants, shops, and farms. The control of the material means of production is a social function, subject to the confirmation or revocation by the sovereign consumers. This is what the modern concept of freedom means. Every adult is free to fashion his life according to his own plans. He is not forced to live according to the plan of a planning authority enforcing its unique plan by the police, i.e., the social apparatus of compulsion and coercion. What restricts the individual's freedom is not other people's violence or threat of violence, but the physiological structure of his body and the inescapable nature-given scarcity of the factors of production. It is obvious that man's discretion to shape his fate can never trespass the limits drawn by what are called the laws of nature. To establish these facts does not amount to a justification of the individual's freedom from the point of view of an absolute standards or metaphysical notions. It does not express any judgment on the fashionable doctrines of the advocates of totalitarianism, whether quote-unquote right or quote-unquote left. It does not deal with their assertion that the masses are too stupid and ignorant to know what would serve best their quote-unquote true needs and interests and badly need a guardian, the government, lest they hurt themselves. Neither does it enter into a scrutiny of the statements that there are supermen available for the office of such guardianship. Part 2. The urge for economic betterment. Under capitalism, the common man enjoys amenities which in ages gone by were unknown and therefore inaccessible even to the richest people. But of course, these motor cars, television sets, and refrigerators do not make a man happy. In the instant which he acquires them, he may feel happier than he did before. But as soon as some of his wishes are satisfied, new wishes spring up. Such is human nature. Few Americans are fully aware of the fact that their country enjoys the highest standard of living, and that the way of life of the average American appears as fabulous and out of the reach of the immense majority of people inhabiting non-capitalistic countries. Most people belittle what they have and could possibly acquire, and crave those things which are inaccessible to them. It would be idle to lament this insatiable appetite for more and more goods. This lust is precisely the impulse which leads man on the way toward economic betterment. To content oneself with what one already has, to content oneself with what one has already got or can easily get, and to abstain apathetically from any attempts to improve one's own material conditions, is not a virtue. Such an attitude is rather animal behavior than conduct of reasonable human beings. Man's most characteristic mark is that he never ceases in endeavors to advance his well-being by purposive activity. However, these endeavors must be fitted for the purpose. They must be suitable to bring about the effects aimed at. What is wrong with most of our contemporaries is not that they are passionately longing for a richer supply of various goods, but that they choose inappropriate means for the attainment of this end. They are misled by spurious ideologies. They favor policies which are contrary to their own rightly understood vital interests. Too dull to see the inevitable long-run consequences of their conduct, they find delight in its passing short-run effects. They advocate measures which are bound to result, finally, in general impoverishment, in the disintegration of social cooperation under the principle of the division of labor, and in a return to barbarism. There is but one means available to improve the material conditions of mankind: to accelerate the growth of capital accumulated as against the growth in population. The greater the amount of capital invested per head of the worker, the more and the better goods can be produced and consumed. This is what capitalism, the much abused profit system, has brought about and brings about daily anew. Yet, most present-day governments and political parties are eager to destroy this system. Why do they all loathe capitalism? Why do they, while enjoying the well-being capitalism bestows upon them, cast longing glances upon the quote-unquote good old days of the past and the miserable conditions of the present-day Russian worker? Part 3. Status Society and Capitalism. Before answering this question, it is necessary to put into better relief the distinctive feature of capitalism as against that of a status society. It is quite customary to liken the entrepreneurs and capitalists of the market economy to the aristocrats of a status society. The basis of the comparison is the relative riches of both groups as against the relatively straitened conditions of the rest of their fellow men. However, in resorting to this metaphor, one fails to realize the fundamental difference between aristocratic riches and quote-unquote bourgeois or capitalistic riches. The wealth of an aristocrat is not a market phenomenon. It does not originate from supplying the consumers and cannot be withdrawn or even affected by any action on the part of the public. It stems from conquest or from largesse on the part of a conqueror. It may come to an end through the revocation on the part of the donor or through violent eviction on the part of another conqueror, or it may be dissipated by extravagance. The feudal lord does not serve consumers and is immune to the displeasure of the populace. The entrepreneurs and capitalists owe their wealth to the people who patronize their business. They lose it inevitably as soon as other men supplant them in serving the consumers better or cheaper. It is not the task of this essay to describe the historical conditions which brought about the institutions of caste and status, of the subdivisions of people into hereditary groups with different ranks, rights, claims, and legally sanctified privileges or disabilities. What alone is of importance for us is the fact that the preservation of these feudal institutions was incompatible with a system of capitalism. Their abolition and the establishment of the principle of equality under the law removed the barriers that prevented mankind from enjoying all those benefits which the system of private ownership of the means of production and in private enterprise makes possible. In a society based on rank, status, or caste, an individual's station in life is fixed. He is born into a certain station, and his position in society is rigidly determined by the laws and customs which assign to each member of his rank definite privileges and duties or definite disabilities. Exceptionally good or bad luck may in some rare cases elevate an individual into a higher rank or debase him into a lower rank. But as a rule, the conditions of the individual members of a definite order or rank can improve or deteriorate only with a change in the conditions of the whole membership. The individual is primarily not a citizen of a nation. He is a member of an estate, and only as such indirectly integrated into the body of his nation. In coming into contact with a countryman belonging to another rank, he does not feel any community. He perceives only the gulf that separates him from the other man's status. This diversity was reflected in linguistic as well as sartorial usages. Under the ancient regime, the European aristocrats spoke preferably French. The Third Estate used the vernacular, while the lower ranks of the urban population and the peasants clung to local dialects, jargons, and argots, which often were incomprehensible to the educated. The various ranks dressed differently. No one could fail to recognize the rank of a stranger whom he happened to see somewhere. The main criticism leveled against the principle of equality under the law by the eulogists of the good old days is that it has abolished the privileges of rank and dignity. It has, they say, quote-unquote, atomized society, dissolved its quote-unquote organic subdivisions into quote-unquote amorphous masses. The quote-unquote much too many are now supreme, and their mean materialism has superseded the noble standards of ages gone by. Money is king. Quite worthless people enjoy riches in abundance, while meritorious and worthy people go empty-handed. This criticism tacitly implies that under the ancient regime, the aristocrats were distinguished by their virtue, and that they owed their rank and their revenues to their moral and cultural superiority. It is hardly necessary to debunk this fable. Without expressing any judgment of value, the historian cannot help emphasizing that the high aristocracy of the main European countries were the descendants of those soldiers, courtiers, and courtesans who, in the religious and constitutional struggles of the 16th and 17th centuries, had cleverly sided with the party that remained victorious in their respective countries. While the conservative and the quote-unquote progressive foes of capitalism disagree with regard to the evaluation of the old standards, they fully agree in condemning the standards of capitalistic society. As they see it, not those who deserve well of their fellow men acquire wealth and prestige, but frivolous, unworthy people. Both groups pretend to aim at the substitution of fairer methods of quote-unquote distribution for the manifestly unfair methods prevailing under laissez-faire capitalism. Now, nobody ever contended that under unhampered capitalism, those fare best who, from the point of view of eternal standards of value, ought to be preferred. What the capitalistic democracy of the market brings about is not rewarding people according to their quote-unquote true merits, inherent worth, and moral eminence. What makes a man more or less prosperous is not the evaluation of his contribution from any quote-unquote absolute principle of justice, but evaluation on the part of his fellow men, who will exclusively apply the yardstick of their own personal wants, desires, and ends. It is precisely this that the democratic system of the market means. The consumers are supreme, i.e., sovereign. They want to be satisfied. Millions of people like to drink Pinka Pinka, a beverage prepared by the world-embracing Pinka Pinka company. Millions like detective stories, mystery pictures, tabloid newspapers, bullfights, boxing, whiskey, cigarettes, chewing gum. Millions vote for governments eager to arm and to wage war. Thus, the entrepreneurs who provide in the best and cheapest way all the things required for the satisfaction of these wants succeed in getting rich. What counts in the frame of the market economy is not academic judgments of value, but the valuations actually manifested by people in buying or not buying. To the grumbler who complains about the unfairness of the market system, only one piece of advice can be given. If you want to acquire more wealth, then try to satisfy the public by offering them something that is cheaper or which they like better. Try to supersede Pinka Pinka by mixing another beverage. Equality under the law gives you the power to challenge every millionaire. It is, in a market system not sabotaged by government-imposed restrictions, exclusively your fault if you do not outstrip the chocolate king, the movie star, and the boxing champion. But if you prefer to the riches you may perhaps acquire in engaging in the garment trade or in professional boxing, the satisfaction you may derive from writing poetry or philosophy, you are free to do so. Then, of course, you will not make as much money as those who serve the majority. For such is the law of the economic democracy of the market. Those who satisfy the wants of a smaller number of people only collect fewer votes, dollars, than those who satisfy the wants of more people. In money-making, the movie star outstrips the philosopher. The manufacturers of Pinka Pinka outstrip the composer of symphonies. It is important to realize that the opportunity to compete for the prizes society has to dispense is a social institution. It cannot remove or alleviate the innate handicaps with which nature has discriminated against many people. It cannot change the fact that many are born sick or become disabled later in life. The biological equipment of a man rigidly restricts the field in which he can serve. The class of those who have the ability to think their own thoughts is through an unbridgeable gulf separated from the class of those who cannot. Part 4. The resentment of frustrated ambition. Now we can try to understand why people loathe capitalism. In a society based on caste and status, the individual can ascribe adverse fate to conditions beyond his own control. He is a slave because the superhuman powers that determine all becoming had assigned him this rank. It is not his doing, and there is no reason for him to be ashamed of his humbleness. His wife cannot find fault with his station. If she were to tell him, quote, "Why are you not a duke? If you were a duke, I would be a duchess," end quote, he would reply, quote, "If I had been born the son of a duke, I would not have married you, a slave girl, but the daughter of another duke. That you are not a duchess is exclusively your own fault. Why were you not more clever in the choice of your parents?" End quote. It is quite another thing under capitalism. Here, everybody's station in life depends on his own doing. Everybody whose ambitions have not been fully gratified knows very well that he has missed chances, that he has been tried and found wanting by his fellow man. If his wife upbraids him, quote, "Why do you make only $8 a week? If you were as smart as your former pal Paul, you would be a foreman, and I would enjoy a better life," end quote, he becomes conscious of his own inferiority and feels humiliated. The much talked about sternness of capitalism consists in the fact that it handles everybody according to his contribution to the well-being of his fellow men. The sway of the principle, to each according to his accomplishments, does not allow of any excuse for personal shortcomings. Everybody knows very well that there are people like himself who succeeded where he himself failed. Everybody knows that many of those whom he envies are self-made men who started from the same point from which he himself started. And much worse, he knows that all other people know it too. He reads in the eyes of his wife and his children the silent reproach, quote, "Why have you not been smarter?" End quote. He sees how people admire those who have been more successful than he and look with contempt or with pity on his failure. What makes many feel unhappy under capitalism is the fact that capitalism grants to each the opportunity to attain the most desirable positions, which, of course, can only be attained by a few. Whatever a man may have gained for himself, it is mostly a mere fraction of what his ambition has impelled him to win. There are always before his eyes people who had succeeded where he failed. There are fellows who have outstripped him and against whom he nurtures, in his subconsciousness, inferiority complexes. Such is the attitude of the tramp against the man with a regular job, the factory hand against the foreman, the executive against the vice president against the company's president, the man who is worth $300,000 against the millionaire, and so on. Everybody's self-reliance and moral equilibrium are undermined by the spectacle of those who have given proof of greater abilities and capacities. Everybody is aware of his own defeat and insufficiency. The long line of German authors who radically rejected the quote-unquote Western ideas of the Enlightenment and the social philosophy of rationalism, utilitarianism, and laissez-faire, as well as the policies advanced by these schools of thought, was opened by Justus Moser. One of the novel principles which aroused Moser's anger was the demand that the promotion of army officers and civil servants should depend on personal merit and ability, and not on the incumbent's ancestry and noble lineage, his age and length of service. Life in a society which success would exclusively depend on personal merit would, says Moser, simply be unbearable. As human nature is, everybody is prone to overrate his own worth and deserts. If a man's station in life is conditioned by factors other than his inherent excellence, those who remain at the bottom of the ladder can acquiesce in this outcome and, knowing their own worth, still preserve their dignity and self-respect. But it is different if merit alone decides. Then the unsuccessful feel themselves insulted and humiliated. Hate and enmity against all those who superseded them must result. The price and market system of capitalism is such a society in which merit and achievements determine a man's success or failure. Whatever one may think of Moser's bias against the merit principle, one must admit that he was right in describing one of its psychological consequences. He had an insight into the feelings of those who had been tried and found wanting. In order to console himself and to restore his self-assertion, such a man is in search of a scapegoat. He tries to persuade himself that he failed through no fault of his own. He is at least as brilliant, efficient, and industrious as those who outshine him. Unfortunately, this nefarious social order of ours does not accord the prizes to the most meritorious men. It crowns the dishonest, unscrupulous scoundrel, the swindler, the exploiter, the quote-unquote rugged individualist. What made himself fail was his honesty. He was too decent to resort to the base tricks to which his successful rivals owe their ascendancy. As conditions are under capitalism, a man is forced to choose between virtue and poverty on the one hand, and vice and riches on the other. He himself, thank God, chose the former alternative and rejected the latter. This search for a scapegoat is an attitude of people living under the social order which treats everybody according to his contribution to the well-being of his fellow men, and where thus everybody is the founder of his own future. In such a society, each member whose ambitions have not been fully satisfied resents the fortune of all those who succeeded better. The fool releases these feelings in slander and defamation. The more sophisticated do not indulge in personal calumny. They sublimate their hatred into a philosophy, the philosophy of anti-capitalism, in order to render inaudible the inner voice that tells them that their failure is entirely their own fault. Their fanaticism in defending their critique of capitalism is precisely due to the fact that they are fighting their own awareness of its falsity. The suffering from frustrated ambition is peculiar to people living in a society of equality under the law. It is not caused by equality under the law, but by the fact that in a society of equality under the law, the inequality of men with regard to intellectual abilities, willpower, and application becomes visible. The gulf between what a man is and achieves and what he thinks of his own abilities and achievements is pitilessly revealed. Daydreams of a quote-unquote fair world, which would treat him according to his quote-unquote real worth, are the refuge of all those plagued by a lack of self-knowledge. Part 5. The resentment of the intellectuals. The common man, as a rule, does not have the opportunity of consorting with people who have succeeded better than he has. He moves in the circle of other common men. He never meets his boss socially. He never learns from personal experience how different an entrepreneur or an executive is with regard to all those abilities and faculties which are required for successfully serving the consumers. His envy and the resentment it engenders are not directed against a living being of flesh and blood, but against pale abstractions like, quote-unquote, management, capital, and Wall Street. It is impossible to abominate such a faint shadow with the same bitterness of feeling that one may bear against a fellow creature whom one encounters daily. It is different with people whom special conditions of their occupation or their family affiliation bring into personal contact with the winners of the prizes which, as they believe, by rights should have been given to themselves. With them, the feelings of frustrated ambition become especially poignant because they engender hatred of concrete living beings. They loathe capitalism because it has assigned to this other man the position which they themselves would like to have. Such is the case with those people who are commonly called the intellectuals. Take, for instance, the physicians. Daily routine and experience make every doctor cognizant of the fact that there exists a hierarchy in which all medical men are graded according to their merits and achievements. Those more eminent than he himself is, those whose methods and innovations he must learn and practice in order to be up to date, were his classmates in the medical school. They served with him as interns. They attend with him the meetings of medical associations. He meets them at the bedside of patients as well as in social gatherings. Some of them are his personal friends or related to him, and they all behave toward him with the utmost civility and address him as their dear colleague. But they tower far above him in the appreciation of the public and also in height of income. They have outstripped him and now belong to another class of men. When he compares himself with them, he feels humiliated. But he must watch himself carefully, lest anybody notice his resentment and envy. Even the slightest indication of such feelings would be looked upon as very bad manners and would depreciate him in the eyes of everybody. He must swallow down his mortification and divert his wrath toward a vicarious target. He indicts society's economic organization, the nefarious system of capitalism. But for this unfair regime, his abilities and talents, his zeal and his achievements would have brought him the rich reward they deserve. It is the same way with many lawyers and teachers, artists and actors, writers and journalists, architects and scientific research workers, engineers and chemists. They, too, feel frustrated because they are vexed by the ascendancy of their more successful colleagues, their former schoolfellows and cronies. Their resentment is deepened by precisely those codes of professional conduct and ethics that throw a veil of comradeship and colleagueship over the reality of competition. To understand the intellectual's abhorrence of capitalism, one must realize that in his mind, this system is incarnated in a definite number of compeers whose success he resents and whom he makes responsible for the frustration of his own far-flung ambitions. His passionate dislike of capitalism is a mere blind for his hatred of some successful, quote-unquote, colleagues. Part 6. The anti-capitalistic bias of American intellectuals. The anti-capitalistic bias of the intellectuals is a phenomenon not limited to one or a few countries only, but it is more general and more bitter in the United States than it is in European countries. To explain this rather surprising fact, one must deal with what one calls quote-unquote society, or in French, also le monde. In Europe, society includes all those eminent in any sphere of activity. Statesmen and parliamentary leaders, The heads of the various departments of the civil service, publishers and editors of the main newspapers and magazines, prominent writers, scientists, artists, actors, musicians, engineers, lawyers, and physicians formed together with outstanding businessmen and scions of aristocratic and patrician families what is considered the good society. They come into contact with one another at dinner and tea parties, charity balls and bazaars, at first nights and varnishing days. They frequent the same restaurants, hotels, and resorts. When they meet, they take their pleasure in conversation about intellectual matters, a mode of social intercourse first developed in Italy of the Renaissance, perfected in the Parisian salons, and later imitated by the society of all important cities of Western and Central Europe. New ideas and ideologies find their response in these social gatherings before they begin to influence broader circles. One cannot deal with the history of the fine arts and literature in the 19th century without analyzing the role society played in encouraging or discouraging their protagonists. Access to European society is open to everybody who has distinguished himself in any field. It may be easier to people of noble ancestry and great wealth than to commoners with modest incomes. But neither riches nor titles can give to a member of this set the rank and prestige that is the reward of great personal distinction. The stars of the Parisian salons are not the millionaires, but the members of the Académie Française. The intellectuals prevail, and the others feign at least a lively interest in intellectual concerns. Society in this sense is foreign to the American scene. What is called quote-unquote society in the United States almost exclusively consists of the richest families. There is little social intercourse between the successful businessmen and the nation's eminent authors, artists, and scientists. Those listed in the social register do not meet socially the molders of public opinion and the harbingers of the ideas that will determine the future of the nation. Most of the quote-unquote socialites are not interested in books and ideas. When they meet and do not play cards, they gossip about persons and talk more about sports than about cultural matters. But even those who are not averse to reading consider writers, scientists, and artists as people with whom they do not want to consort. An almost insurmountable gulf separates quote-unquote society from intellectuals. It is possible to explain the emergence of this situation historically, but such an explanation does not alter the facts. Neither can it remove or alleviate the resentment with which the intellectuals react to the contempt in which they are held by the members of society. American authors or scientists are prone to consider the wealthy businessman as a barbarian, as a man exclusively intent upon making money. The professor despises the alumni who are more interested in the university's football team than in its scholastic achievements. He feels insulted if he learns that the coach gets a higher salary than an eminent professor of philosophy. The men whose research has given rise to new methods of production hate the businessmen who are merely interested in the cash value of their research work. It is very significant that a large number of American research physicists sympathize with socialism or communism, as they are ignorant of economics and realize that the university teachers of economics are also opposed to what they disparagingly call the profit system. No other attitude can be expected from them. If a group of people secludes itself from the rest of the nation, especially also from its intellectual leaders, in the way American socialites do, they unavoidably become the target of rather hostile criticisms on the part of those whom they keep out of their own circles. The exclusivism practiced by the American rich has made them in a certain sense outcasts. They may take a vain pride in their own distinction. What they fail to see is that their self-chosen segregation isolates them and kindles animosities which make the intellectuals inclined to favor anti-capitalistic policies. Part 7. the resentment of the white-collar workers. Besides being harassed by the general hatred of capitalism common to most people, the white-collar worker labors under two special afflictions peculiar to his own category. Sitting behind a desk and committing words and figures to paper, he is prone to overrate the significance of his work. Like the boss, he writes and reads what other fellows have put on paper and talks directly or over the telephone with other people. Full of conceit, he imagines himself to belong to the enterprise's managing elite and compares his own tasks with those of his boss. As a quote-unquote worker by brain, he looks arrogantly down upon the manual worker whose hands are calloused and soiled. It makes him furious to notice that many of these manual laborers get higher pay and are more respected than he himself. What a shame, he thinks, that capitalism fondles the simple drudgery of the quote-unquote uneducated and does not appraise his quote-unquote intellectual work according to its quote-unquote true value. In nursing such atavistic ideas about the significance of office work and manual work, the white-collar man shuts his eyes to a realistic evaluation of the situation. He does not see that his own clerical job consists in the performance of routine tasks which require but a simple training, while the quote-unquote hands, whom he envies, are the highly skilled mechanics and technicians who know how to handle the intricate machines and contrivances of modern industry. It is precisely this complete misconstruction of the real state of affairs that discloses the clerk's lack of insight and power of reasoning. On the other hand, the clerical worker, like professional people, is plagued by daily contact with men who have succeeded better than he. He sees some of his fellow employees who started from the same level with him make a career within the hierarchy of the office, while he remains at the bottom. Only yesterday, Paul was in the same rank with him. Today, Paul has a more important and better paid assignment. And yet, he thinks, Paul is in every regard inferior to himself. Certainly, he concludes, Paul owes his advancement to those mean tricks and artifices that can further a man's career only under this unfair system of capitalism, which all books and newspapers, all scholars and politicians, denounce as the root of all mischief and misery. The classical expression of the clerk's conceit and their fanciful belief that their own subaltern jobs are a part of the entrepreneurial activities and congeneric with the work of their bosses is to be found in Lenin's description of the, quote, control of production and distribution, end quote, as provided by his most popular essay. Lenin himself and most of his fellow conspirators never learned anything about the operation of the market economy and never wanted to. All they knew about capitalism was that Marx had described it as the worst of all evils. They were professional revolutionaries. The only sources of their earnings were the party funds which were fed by voluntary, and more often involuntary, extorted contributions and subscriptions and by violent, quote-unquote, expropriations. But before 1917, as exiles in Western and Central Europe, some of the comrades occasionally held subaltern routine jobs in business firms. It was their experience, the experience of clerks who had to fill out forms and blanks, to copy letters, to enter figures into books and to file papers, which provided Lenin with all the information he had acquired about entrepreneurial activities. Lenin correctly distinguishes between the work of the entrepreneurs on the one hand and that of the, quote, scientifically educated staff of engineers, agronomists, and so on, end quote, on the other hand. These experts and technologists are mainly executors of orders. They obey under capitalism the capitalists. They will obey under socialism, quote, the armed workers, end quote. The function of the capitalists and entrepreneurs is different. It is, according to Lenin, quote, control of production and distribution of labor and products, end quote. Now, the tasks of the entrepreneurs and capitalists are in fact the determination of the purposes for which the factors of production are to be employed in order to serve in the best possible way the wants of the consumers, i.e., to determine what should be produced, in what quantities, and in what quality. However, this is not the meaning that Lenin attaches to the term control. As a Marxian, he was unaware of the problems the conduct of production activities has to face under any imaginable system of social organization. The inevitable scarcity of the factors of production, the uncertainty of future conditions for which production has to provide, and the necessity of picking out from the bewildering multitude of technological methods suitable for attainment of ends already chosen those which obstruct as little as possible the attainment of other ends, i.e., those with which the cost of production is lowest. No allusion to these matters can be found in the writings of Marx and Engels. All that Lenin learned about business from the tales of his comrades, who occasionally sat in business offices, was that it required a lot of scribbling, recording, and ciphering. Thus, he declares that, quote-unquote, accounting and control are the chief things necessary for the organizing and correct functioning of society. But a quote-unquote accounting and control, he goes on saying, have already been, quote, simplified by capitalism to the utmost, that they have become the extraordinarily simple operations of watching, recording, and issuing receipts within the reach of anybody who can read and write and knows the first 4 rules of arithmetic, end quote. Here we have the philosophy of the filing clerk in its full glory. Part 8. The resentment of the cousins. On the market not hampered by the interference of external forces, the process which tends to convey control of the factors of production into the hands of the most efficient people never stops. As soon as a man or a firm begins to slacken in endeavors to meet, in the best possible way, the most urgent if of the not yet properly satisfied needs of the consumers, dissipation of the wealth accumulated by previous success in such endeavors sets in. Often this dispersion of the fortune starts already in the lifetime of the businessman, when his buoyancy, energy, and resourcefulness become weakened by the impact of old age, fatigue, and sickness, and his ability to adjust the conduct of his affairs to the unceasingly changing structure of the market fades away. More frequently, it is the sluggishness of his heirs that fritters away the heritage. If the dull and stolid progeny do not sink back into insignificance and in spite of their incompetence remain moneyed people, they owe their prosperity to institutions and political measures which were dictated by anti-capitalist tendencies. They withdraw from the market, where there is no means of preserving acquired wealth other than acquiring it anew each day in tough competition with everybody, with the already existing firms as well as with newcomers, quote-unquote, operating on a shoestring. In buying government bonds, they flee under the wings of the government which promises to safeguard them against the dangers of the market in which losses are the penalty of inefficiency. However, there are families in which the eminent capacities required for the entrepreneurial success are propagated through several generations. 1 or 2 of the sons or grandsons, or even great-grandsons, equal or excel their forebear. The ancestor's wealth is not dissipated, but grows more and more. These cases are, of course, not frequent. They attract attention not only on account of their rarity, but also on account of the fact that men who know how to enlarge an inherited business enjoy a double prestige, the esteem shown to their fathers and that shown to themselves. Such quote-unquote patricians, as they are sometimes called by people who ignore the difference between a status society and the capitalistic society, for the most part combine in their persons breeding, fineness of taste, and gracious manners with the skill and industriousness of a hard-working businessman. And some of them belong to the country's, or even the world's, richest entrepreneurs. It is the conditions of these few richest among these so-called patrician families which we must scrutinize in order to explain a phenomenon that plays an important role in modern anti-capitalistic propaganda and machinations. Even in these lucky families, the qualities required for the successful conduct of big business are not inherited by all sons and grandsons. As a rule, only one, or at best two, of each generation are endowed with them. Then it is essential for the survival of the family's wealth and business that the conduct of affairs be entrusted to this one or to these two, and that the other members be relegated to the position of mere recipients of a quota of the proceeds. The methods chosen for such arrangements vary from country to country, according to the special provisions of the national and local laws. Their effect, however, is always the same. They divide the family into two categories: those who direct the conduct of affairs and those who do not. The second category consists, as a rule, of people closely related to those of the first category, whom we propose to call the bosses. They are brothers, cousins, nephews of the bosses, more often their sisters, widowed sisters-in-law, female cousins, nieces, and so on. We propose to call the members of this second category the cousins. The cousins derive their revenues from the firm or corporation, but they are foreign to business life and know nothing about the problems an entrepreneur has to face. They have been brought up in fashionable boarding schools and colleges whose atmosphere was filled by a haughty contempt for banausic money-making. Some of them pass their time in nightclubs and other places of amusement, bet and gamble, feast and revel, and indulge in expensive debauchery. Others amateurishly busy themselves with painting, writing, or other arts. Thus, most of them are idle and useless people. It is true that there have been and are exceptions, and that the achievements of these exceptional members of the group of cousins by far outweigh the scandals raised by the provoking behavior of the playboys and spendthrifts. Many of the most eminent authors, scholars, and statesmen were such quote-unquote gentlemen of no occupation. Free from the necessity of earning a living by a gainful occupation and dependent of the favor of those addicted to bigotry, they became pioneers of new ideas. Others, themselves lacking the inspiration, became the mecenas of artists who, without the financial aid and the applause received, would not have been in a position to accomplish their creative work. The role that moneyed men played in Great Britain's intellectual and political evolution has been stressed by many historians. The milieu in which the authors and artists of 19th century France lived and found encouragement was le monde, society. However, we deal here neither with the sins of the playboys nor with the excellence of their groups of wealthy people. Our theme is the part which a special group of cousins took in the dissemination of doctrines aiming at the destruction of the market economy. Many cousins believe that they have been wronged by the arrangements regulating their financial relation to the bosses in the family's firm. Whether these arrangements were made by the will of their father or grandfather, or by an agreement which they themselves have signed, they think that they are receiving too little and the bosses too much. Unfamiliar with the nature of business and the market, they are, with Marx, convinced that capital automatically, quote-unquote, begets profits. They do not see any reason why those members of the family who are in charge of the conduct of affairs should earn more than they. Too dull to appraise correctly the meaning of balance sheets and profit and loss accounts, they suspect in every act of the bosses a sinister attempt to cheat them and to deprive them of their birthright. They quarrel with them continually. It is not astonishing that the bosses lose their temper. They are proud of their success in overcoming all the obstacles which governments and labor unions place in the way of big business. They are fully aware of the fact that, but for their efficiency and zeal, the firm would either have long since gone astray, or the family would have been forced to sell out. They believe that the cousins should do justice to their merits, and they find their complaints simply impudent and outrageous. The family feud between the bosses and the cousins concerns only the members of the clan, but it attains general importance when the cousins, in order to annoy the bosses, join the anti-capitalistic camp and provide the funds for all kinds of quote-unquote progressive ventures. The cousins are enthusiastic in supporting strikes, even strikes in the factories from which their own revenues originate. It is a well-known fact that most of the quote-unquote progressive magazines and many quote-unquote progressive newspapers entirely depend on the subsidies lavishly granted by them. These cousins endow progressive universities and colleges and institutes for quote-unquote social research and sponsor all sorts of Communist Party activities. As quote-unquote parlor socialists and quote-unquote penthouse Bolsheviks, they play an important role in the quote-unquote proletarian army, fighting against the quote-unquote dismal system of capitalism. Part 9. The Communism of Broadway and Hollywood. The many to whom capitalism gave a comfortable income and leisure are yearning for entertainment. Crowds throng to the theaters. There is money in show business. Popular actors and playwrights enjoy a six-figure income. They live in palatial houses with butlers and swimming pools. They are certainly not, quote-unquote, prisoners of starvation. Yet Hollywood and Broadway, the world-famous centers of the entertainment industry, are hotbeds of communism. Authors and performers are to be found among the most bigoted supporters of Sovietism. Various attempts have been made to explain this phenomenon. There is in most of these interpretations a grain of truth. However, they all fail to take account of the main motive that drives champions of the stage and the screen into the ranks of revolutionaries. Under capitalism, material success depends on the appreciation of a man's achievements on the part of the sovereign consumers. In this regard, there is no difference between the services rendered by a manufacturer and those rendered by a producer, an actor, or a playwright. Yet the awareness of this dependence makes those in the show business much more uneasy than those supplying the customers with tangible amenities. The manufacturers of tangible goods know that their products are purchased because of certain physical properties. They may reasonably expect that the public will continue to ask for these commodities as long as nothing better or cheaper is afforded to them, for it is unlikely that the needs which these goods satisfy will change in the near future. The state of the market for these goods can, to some extent, be anticipated by intelligent entrepreneurs. They can, with a degree of confidence, look into the future. It is another thing with entertainment. People long for amusement because they are bored, and nothing makes them so weary as amusements with which they are already familiar. The essence of the entertainment industry is variety. The patrons applaud most what is new and therefore unexpected and surprising. They are capricious and unaccountable. They disdain what they cherished yesterday. A tycoon of the stage or the screen must always fear the waywardness of the public. He awakes rich and famous one morning and may be forgotten the next day. He knows very well that he depends entirely on the whims and fancies of a crowd hankering after merriment. He is always agitated by anxiety. Like the master builder in Ibsen's play, he fears the unknown newcomers, the vigorous youths who will supplant him in the favor of the public. It is obvious that there is no relief from what makes these stage people uneasy. Thus they catch at a straw. Communism, some of them think, will bring their deliverance. Is it not a system that makes all people happy? Do not very eminent men declare that all the evils of mankind are caused by capitalism and will be wiped out by communism? Are not they themselves hardworking people, comrades of all other working men? it may be fairly assumed that none of the Hollywood and Broadway communists has ever studied the writings of any socialist author, and still less any serious analysis of the market economy. But it is this very fact that, to these glamorous girls, dancers, and singers, to these authors and producers of comedies, moving pictures, and songs, gives the strange illusion that their particular grievances will disappear as soon as the quote-unquote expropriators will be expropriated. There are people who blame capitalism for the stupidity and crudeness of many products of the entertainment industry. There is no need to argue this point, but it is noteworthy to remember that no other American milieu was more enthusiastic in the endorsement of communism than that of people cooperating in the production of these silly plays and films. When a future historian searches for those little significant facts which Taine appreciated highly as source material, he should not neglect to mention the role which the world's most famous striptease artist played in the American radical movement. Whew. That concludes Chapter 1. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. After getting through what was an incredibly long read, an incredibly difficult read for me, which we'll get into in just a bit. But the short version of what we are actually going to be reading with the entire book is basically introduced in the introduction. This is really just an incredibly long essay whose thesis is centered around what has caused the proliferation of the anti-capitalist mentality. It's 2022, it's January 2022. I thought this is an incredibly apropos topic for the time, and just neat to get insight from somebody who wrote about this almost 70 years ago. I'd like to start too quickly with the title of the book is not the a-capitalistic mentality, it's the anti-capitalistic mentality. It means that we're not talking about people who just aren't capitalists, but who are actively opposed to capitalism. And again, I think you guys can understand, where I'm coming from. When I say that this is so apropos today, when I'm specifically differentiating between people who just aren't capitalists and people who are actively opposed to it, and consider capitalism as some sort of axiomatic evil, and use the word to describe some sort of boogeyman. First thing first, and when it comes to the question of what has caused the proliferation of the anti-capitalist mentality, spoiler alert, I'm just going to say it. His answer is ignorance. And we're going to get more into that not only later in this analysis, but he actually reveals that later on in the book, though he kind of dabbles in that at the end of this read. So Chapter 1 can really be broken into, he broke it into 9 parts, but it can really be broken into 2 parts. Parts 1 through 4, which are what is this idea of capitalism, and then parts 5 through 9, what is the anti-capitalist mentality? Which I think is probably the way you should be introducing this thesis. Describe what the things are that you're talking about, and then get into the actual thesis as to what it is you think is the cause of this proliferation. Parts 1 through 4 read a lot like a condensed version of previous reads that we've done on this channel. A huge amount of it sounds like Adam Smith. In fact, he goes so far as to, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, in fact, he goes so far as to just simply state Smith's lesson, basically. And this is page 4. The entrepreneurs and capitalists owe their wealth to the people who patronize their business. As in, if people don't patronize their business, you can't. If people don't engage in these mutually consensual transactions, you can't possibly get rich. There's a lot of Hazlitt in here. In fact, so that's economics in one lesson. There's a lot of Hazlitt in here. And we'll get into why there's actually kind of some soul in here, even though soul didn't have any writings until long after Ludwig von Mises released this entry. The book, too, as I'll speak more broadly, is a direct criticism of Marx. Not a criticism of the ideas of Marx that were espoused later by guys like Keynes, though he does talk about Keynes later on in the book. Get into that in a minute. But directly a criticism of Marx's works, and Mises will reveal later on in the book that he's actually read Das Kapital by Marx and Engels, and has actually read the Communist Manifesto. He will quote that later on in the book, which we will get to in future reads. But primarily what he does in this chapter in terms of that is reject objective theory of value. And in more specifically, the labor theory of value, which is obviously true. Something to me is worth a different amount to somebody else, and that's how we get mutual exchanges. This is an extension of Smith's lesson. The subjective theory of value is obviously true, because if I give the clerk at the gas station $2 and he gives me the candy bar, that means he values that $2 as being greater in value than that candy bar. But I don't. As in, I value the candy bar as being worth more than $2. Otherwise, we wouldn't engage in this transaction. Otherwise, if we thought that we were losing, as long as there is consent in this transaction, we wouldn't engage in it. Now, maybe that would be a loss in some cases, but on the whole, this is how we get the phenomenal growth that Ludwig von Mises alluded to during the Industrial Revolution. So in his critique of the labor theory of value and his critique of Marx, and in particular the objective theory of value, which is obviously false, he begins on page 5, quote, "What the capitalistic democracy of the market brings about is not rewarding people according to their true merits, inherent worth," so it would be some sort of objective value, "and moral eminence. What makes a man more or less prosperous is not the evaluation of his contribution from any absolute principle of justice." So in here he's saying that this is Marx's objective theory of value is just false. He continues on page 9, quote, "Daydreams of a fair world, which would treat him according to his real worth, are the refuge of all those plagued by a lack of self-knowledge," end quote. So here, not only is he critiquing more specifically the labor theory of value, he's also kind of hinting at Dunning-Kruger, which is really interesting considering the Dunning-Kruger effect wasn't something that was realized until much later, until decades later. Remembering that this book was written in 1956, and he continues on to that effect on page 8. Well, he has remarked also on page 8, quote, "As human nature is prone to overrate his own worth and deserts," end quote. That's half true, sort of. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is a two-tailed effect. One, people who are very incompetent at a thing are very likely to highly overrate and over-evaluate their competence at the thing because they're incompetent. They don't know what competence in the thing looks like, so they assume themselves to be at the higher echelon of that, to be more than incredibly incompetent. And the other half of that, which a lot of people forget, is that the people who are at the very high end of that curve, who are extremely competent in a thing, tend to way underestimate their capabilities in that field, to way underestimate their competence, because, man, it just came easy to me. So, like, for me, it was math when I was in high school. Math came incredibly easy to me. I was sleeping through AP Calculus and still getting an A in the class, right? And still got a 5 on the AP exam, having finished it with, like, half the time allotted left. For me, it was incredibly easy, so why isn't it easy for you? And that's the other half of the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? It's if you're incredibly competent in a thing, you're very likely to underrate your competence in the thing. So when he says his human nature is a man is prone to overrate his own worth and deserts, this is half true. First things first, it's only true of the first half of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And it's only true in a circumstance where if the distribution of competence is a perfect bell curve, it's actually not really true, because only the people that are on the very incompetent side of that tail are going to really highly overestimate themselves, their competence. But if that curve isn't a nice bell curve, if the distribution of competence is that there's a lot of people that are super incompetent in the thing, right? That overwhelming majority of people are super incompetent in a thing. Welding, let's say. The overwhelming majority of folks out there do not know how to weld and could not for the life of them bond two pieces of metal together if I just gave them the welding kit and the two pieces of metal. Could not get it to work. right? And will probably hurt themselves. The overwhelming majority of people are not competent when it comes to things like rock climbing, right? When it comes to tying those knots and yeah. So that would be a curve where you wouldn't have a competence curve that would look like this. It would look more like a lot of people in the super, super incompetent, and then just a tiny minority of people that are competent. So his assessment of how people evaluate their competence is probably would be more than less true in the latter distribution than in the former. So if it's a perfect bell curve, not all that true. If it's not, could be true. So it should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways because it's revealed itself basically in the introduction of the book and basically in the way he's framed even the title of the book. Mises is obviously super supportive of what he has labeled here as capitalism, even from a moral standpoint. And he agrees with the libertarian take that capitalism is the most democratic economic system. On page 6, quote, "For such is the law of the economic democracy of the market. Those who satisfy the wants of a smaller number of people only collect fewer votes, dollars, than those who satisfy the wants of people," end quote. By the way, this is just one in an endless list of home run quotes in this book, and a huge part of why I wanted to share this read with you guys. It's because I absolutely love it. But this is absolutely true, that if you're voting with your wallet, then you're casting a vote constantly. And the only people who are going to ascend to these positions that you would like to be in, right? The only people who are going to get Bezos rich are people who serve a ton of people better than, say, their competition, right? The only way you can ascend in a properly free market to be let's say you're getting rich off of laser eye correction, right? Or you're getting rich off of mass producing televisions. The only way you can do that is to produce an incredibly good TV for an incredibly cheap price point, right? In this way, you're serving a ton of voters, right? In the same way, in a way you wouldn't necessarily be if you were an elected representative who's in that term, who serves in that term, basically no matter what. Whereas if Bezos just says screw it and sets fire to all of his money, then all of a sudden he's no longer Bezos rich. If he actually does like Joker in The Dark Knight and makes a pile of cash, pours gas on it, and literally sets it on fire, he's no longer going to be Bezos rich. So this is obviously true. In short, free markets plus free trade means you are free from the tyranny of the majority, because you can always get your goods and services elsewhere. And it's basically the only economic system, if you will, that resolves the tyranny of the majority. All right, so that's the first half of the book, of that read. The second half, in parts 5 through 9, is kind of where he starts to lose me. Not because he's necessarily wrong, but because he's extremely long-winded and extremely long in the tooth. So as you can see, when I was performing this read, this is the part of the read where I was struggling just doing the read. The sentences are 5 miles long. The vocabulary is insane. The way he structures his sentences. It's 1956, and this read is 10 times harder than Henry Hazlitt's Basic Economics, which came out in nearly an identical time. So the vernacular here, excuse me, is just like way over the heads of the common man. And unfortunately, this is even for me, this is an incredibly difficult read. And that's going to be true about Mises in general. So if you guys are going to be recommending to me books from Mises, that's fine. But do understand that these are going to be difficult reads. This is Mises, so just like all the rest of his works, he's needlessly verbose and speaks in a way too complicated manner. Quite frankly, the book is 67 pages long. Saul would have been able to do the whole book in 20 pages. And I think it would have made for a better read in that respect, because it would have been much easier to just get through, and it would be much easier to understand what's going on here. And the book is only 67 pages long, but it's super dense. Again, the same number of pages by Saul could be read in about 2 hours. So there's some concepts that he introduces in the second half that I don't know that he needs to make as complicated as he did. The lesson from the section on society is that the gulf in interests, peer groups, and incomes is something that von Mises attributes to capitalism, in the sense that a capitalism makes it possible to not have to be boxed into these social groups. As in, there's no overlap in these social circles because there doesn't need to be, and there isn't really a reason to be. It's kind of like the scene from South Park where Token finally realizes that he's super rich, and he and his rich friends that he invites to town are playing polo on horseback, and the other boys see them from afar and are like, well, we don't even have the horses to play that game, so we'll just play our game. And they kick each other in the nuts, and that's all they do, right? So by virtue of having the ability to move throughout the income levels, and by virtue of having your supposed status in society, the things that allow you to afford you the things that you actually want, let's say, you kind of separate yourself from the notion of the European idea and concept of society. So you can move up and down depending on how much you provide to the people who are willing to patronize you. Sometimes he sounds like Sol in differentiating, say, doctors from medical researchers. So the doctors are the ones who are doing the thing that is in that field, which tends to bring money. The medical researchers themselves don't necessarily get much money. That's why so much medical research is done just by grants. Or practicing lawyers being differentiated from the philosophers of law and the authors of law, right? So in these cases, in the second half, we're talking about proper intellectuals. In the first half, we're talking about people that have a practiced field, who are doing something, providing a service, say, in the free market. Again, he makes this overly complicated. I think Sol in Intellectuals in Society and Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, which is even better, does a better job of explaining that. I'll put a link in this video's description to my reviews, at least, of each. But in this is where he starts to actually answer the question. What is it that's causing this proliferation of the anti-capitalistic mentality? It's ignorance, kind of coupled with cognitive dissonance, and that kind of leads in this way to communism, which is the way he's describing it is as a bit of a cult and as a bit of a religion. Take that for what you will. On page 12, quote, "It is very significant that such a large number of American research physicists sympathize with socialism or communism, as they are ignorant of economics and realize that the university teachers of economics are also opposed to what they disparagingly call the profit system. No other attitude can be expected from them," end quote. By the way, sound familiar? Does any of this sound familiar? And that's something we're going to be saying a lot, not only in tonight's read, in an analysis of tonight's read, but throughout the course of this book. The same idea holds when it comes to Hollywood. On page 18, quote, "Popular actors and playwrights enjoy a six-figure income. They live in palatial houses with butlers and swimming pools. They certainly are not, quote unquote, prisoners of starvation. Yet Hollywood and Broadway, the world-famous centers of the entertainment industry, are hotbeds of communism." Preaching to the choir here. "Authors and performers are to be found among the most bigoted supporters of Sovietism." Well, there was a time when they couldn't get away with that, and he'll get into that more in later chapters. But my God, does this sound familiar? Do I have to name names, Hassan Piker? But why do they actually get to this conclusion? Why does this proliferate? Again, his answer basically is ignorance. So when now applying to this idea to pro-communist political elites, quote, "All they knew about capitalism was that Marx had described it as the worst of all evils. They were professional revolutionaries." Again, does this sound familiar? It's January 2022. Does this sound familiar? I mean, straight out of Patrice Culler's mouth. Speaking of which, continued on page 14, quote, "The only sources of their earnings were the party funds which were fed by voluntary and more often involuntary, extorted contributions and subscriptions, and by violent, quote-unquote, expropriation. I mean, I just said straight out of Patrice Culler's mouth. Does this sound familiar today to anyone? Fed by voluntary or more often involuntary, extorted contributions and subscriptions by violent expropriation. So this is, again, this part he makes this more confusing than it needs to be. But this is what he was getting at with the cousins section. And again, this sounds really confusing, but it's basically summed up on pages 17 to 18. I want you guys, if you guys were having trouble understanding this, to imagine this as being some kind of like a scene from the movie Casino, starring Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci. Maybe less Goodfellas, more Casino. So this is the part on the cousins. Too dull to appraise correctly the meaning of balance sheets and profit and loss accounts, they suspect in every act of the bosses a sinister attempt to cheat them and to deprive them of their birthright. They quarrel with them continually. Remember, we're thinking like Casino here. It is not astonishing that the bosses lose their temper. They are proud of their success in overcoming all the obstacles which governments and labor unions place in the way of big business. They are fully aware of the fact that, but for their efficiency and zeal, the firm would either have long since gone astray or the family would have been forced to sell out. I mean, this reads like Robert De Niro finally firing that good old boy, right? The good old boy is the cousin, right? Who has, as he describes, who is too dull to appraise correctly the meaning of balance sheets and profit and loss accounts. And they suspect in every act the bosses, so this would be the casino bosses, a sinister attempt to cheat them and to deprive them of their birthright. In this case, in the movie Casino, a literal birthright that Robert De Niro is depriving him of by firing him. They are fully aware of that, but for the efficiency of theirs and zeal, the firm would either have long since gone astray or the family would have been forced to sell out. Again, Robert De Niro. They believe that the cousins should do justice to their merits, and they find their complaints simply impudent and outrageous. The family feud between the bosses and the cousins concerns only the members of the clan. So these are just people that are in the in-group in the casinos who are basically a family in the movie Casino. But it attains general importance when the cousins, in order to annoy the bosses, join the anti-capitalistic camp and provide the funds for all kinds of quote-unquote progressive ventures, as in they form a cartel and make it impossible for De Niro and his bosses to do business. The cousins are enthusiastic in supporting strikes, even strikes in factories from which their revenues originate. It is a well-known fact that most of the progressive magazines and many progressive newspapers entirely depend on the subsidies lavishly granted by them. These cousins endow progressive universities and colleges and institutes for quote-unquote social research and sponsor all sorts of Communist Party activities. As parlor socialists and penthouse Bolsheviks, they play an important role in the proletarian army fighting against the dismal system of capitalism. I mean, just more and more quotes of, does this sound familiar? Hazlitt, Mises will get more into the why that we talked about in chapter 2, but the summation is on page 19. And quote, it is obvious that there is no relief from what makes these stage people uneasy. They catch at a straw, meaning they're grasping at straws. Communism, some of them think, will bring their deliverance. Is it not a system that makes all people happy? Do not very eminent men declare that all the evils of mankind are caused by capitalism and will be wiped out by communism? Are they not they themselves hardworking people, comrades of all other working men? I mean, this excerpt sounds like he's basically characterizing, and this is how they describe it themselves, a cult. It sounds like they're making a religion out of the notion that capitalism is bad. And this is, by the way, where this quote, this is where he continues and gets to my favorite part of the entire read. Quote, it may be fairly assumed that none of the Hollywood and Broadway communists has ever studied the writings of any socialist author, and my favorite part, and still less any serious analysis of the market economy, end quote. So why then would they just simply double down? And here's where we get into what he kind of refers to as cognitive dissonance. We kind of have to backtrack to page 9. Quote, their fanaticism in defending their critique of capitalism is precisely due to the fact they are fighting their own awareness of its falsity. End quote. As in, whenever something obvious wrecks their view on economics, whenever they are forced to face with the reality before them, the only response that they can have is to get even more combative because they don't know anything else. They only know capitalism bad. So when something presents them, so when they build an economic system off of capitalism bad, when something in reality destroys all of this, they have to revert to capitalism bad, hence doubling down, hence the ad hoc, hence not only ad hoc, but post hoc fallacy. Again, does any of this sound familiar? And he's writing this again in 1956. So what he claims really is that with what capitalism does to bring on that cognitive dissonance is simply reveal all of these realities, right? If you don't have capitalism, you don't have all of these revelations that it's not possible for these revelations to take place. He points this out on page 9. In a society of equality under the law, the inequality of men with regard to intellectual abilities, willpower, and application becomes visible. We're actually seeing that when it comes to places like the Nordic countries, which have gone to, say, like extraordinary lengths to make to make the playing field as level as they possibly can, say, for women to get into STEM fields. And what they're actually finding is that the atomization is getting larger, that the disparity of men and women in, say, computer science is actually getting wider in these fields. When you have more freedom, then you have more freedom to do the things that you're basically built to do, right? And I'm not saying this from that women are necessarily built to do, things that aren't related to computer science or vice versa or something along those lines. It's just that the intellectual abilities, willpower, and the application thereof becomes visible because you now have the freedom to do that. You now have nothing in the way of these things becoming visible, right? And so as people become, when you take away all of the social barriers, all that's left is basically what's built into the human being, which isn't necessarily making a case for a biological origin for some of these disparities. But again, the point is, this whole read, just in summation, is nothing more than a ton of sound familiar, amazing quotes, and that's kind of a huge part of why I picked the book. And unbelievably prescient content. Again, almost 70 years ahead of its time. It does read, as we will get into in future reads. It reads more like a work in philosophy than economics, kind of in the same way that human action does. And we'll see more of that later. Again, it is a genuinely needlessly difficult read and of needless length, but it's only 67 pages. And hey, folks, that's Mises. So expect that in future reads, which of course will continue in this series with Chapter 2, The Ordinary Man's Social Philosophy. So I said, as we wrap things up, I said that, I wanted to get your input. If you guys want to hear more Mises, this is what Mises is going to sound like. So let me know in the comment section what it is you want me to read next. Next thing that we'll have in this series, like I said, is going to be Chapter 2, which is entitled, excuse me while I get Chapter 2 back out. Chapter 2, which is entitled The Ordinary Man's Social Philosophy. So we'll do that in our next read in this series. Please, again, let me know in the comment section what you want me to read next. And until then, it's Mike, signing off.